which sent Duke into the storm to look for them. When there had been no sign of them in the wrecked cottage, he'd gone to see Blaine Taylor at the police station. The chief told him he'd found them and taken them to his house to ride out the storm. Duke had been unreasonably relieved to hear they were safe. So much so, he'd gone next door to the cottage to retrieve what possessions he could find, and had delivered clothes, a backpack with a laptop that hadn't been damaged, and other personal items to the Taylors. He'd learned McKenzie, her name was McKenzie, was one of Rosemary's granddaughters, and the little guy was her son, Jax. Then he'd spotted a teddy bear in the rubble, brought it home to clean it up, and delivered that to her, too. That's when he'd asked her if she might be interested in his garage apartment, until she figured out what to do about the cottage. Now, finally, the day that McKenzie and Jax would move into the apartment was upon him. As he stared at his reflection, he tried to see himself the way McKenzie would. He was disappointed to realize that a gorgeous woman like her would probably have no use for a guy like him if he hadn't been offering her a free place to stay after the storm rendered her homeless. His face was pleasant enough, and he'd gotten enough compliments on his blue eyes to decide they were his best feature. They sure beat his beak of a nose, that was for sure. He'd taken the time to clean up his unruly beard, and as he ran a comb through long, dark blonde hair, he wondered if it wasn't time for a haircut. Colorful ink decorated every inch of his torso, stopping just below his jawline. He smiled when he thought about how Rosemary used to tell him to stop using himself like a coloring book and get a hobby. She'd been a delightful friend and neighbor, regularly baking her famous banana bread for him and the guys at the studio. Much of what he knew about life and adulthood had been learned one lesson at a time, as she showed him what he needed to know. He'd looked forward to her arrival every spring and had missed her when she went home to the mainland for the winter. She'd become family to him. Not that she'd known that. When she died, he'd mourned her loss more than he ever had for a single other soul. His mother was still alive and living up by Boston, but she'd been in and out of his life so many times, he hardly thought of her as a parent. He'd spent most of his childhood in foster care, while she was either in rehab or prison. Rosemary had been the mother of his heart. He'd missed her tremendously in the 2 years since she'd passed, and would be eternally thankful for her friendship, especially since that friendship had helped him convince her granddaughter to accept his offer of a place to stay. Without Rosemary's stamp of approval, McKenzie probably would have been afraid to be the guest of a strange, long-haired, bearded, tattooed dude. It had taken hours of elbow grease to make the garage apartment livable. While he'd scrubbed the place, he'd aired out clean sheets, towels, and blankets that had been in the closet for years. After the power returned, he'd washed anything that smelled funky and made her bed with clean, fresh-smelling sheets. The power had continued to be spotty at times. He'd heard in town that one of the main conduits had been severely damaged and needed to be replaced. Apparently, the electric company was waiting on parts that had to be ordered and were hard to find, since the island's grid was so outdated. In the meantime, island residents made do with what they had while hoping it wouldn't go out again. Thankfully, the ferries were back to regular runs, bringing food and gas for generators that had worked overtime all over the island. Everyone he knew had refilled their gas cans in case they lost power again. As he'd finished up at the apartment, it occurred to him that she might want to borrow some sugar or something. That had sent him into a cleaning frenzy in his own home. He sure as hell didn't want her to think he was a slovenly bachelor who couldn't take care of himself, even if he might seem that way at first glance. And honestly, why did he care what she thought of him? She'd come to stay briefly until her cottage was rebuilt, or she decided island life wasn't for her. No sense making